Welcome back to 30 Days of Lightroom. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to stitch together images to create giant panoramic images like this with some really high detail. And this is a pretty simple technique. Once you do it once or twice, it's pretty easy to get the hang of. So let's jump right into this tutorial. So the panorama we have here is 9 photos horizontally stitched together, and it's very important when you're shooting your panorama to have just a little bit of overlap. So I would not want 2 edges of an image to be right next to each other. Have them overlap just a little bit so it's easier for your programs such as Lightroom or Photoshop to stitch those panoramas together. So let's go back into our collection of raw images and restitch this panorama back together and show you exactly how I created it. So you can see down in my film strip here at the bottom, I have a lot of different images color labeled, and you can see I have about 7 images here. My yellow panorama was about 9 images, I believe. I have some green images over here, and I just went and I right-click color label these different images that correspond to each panorama that I wanted to create. Color labels are a quick and simple way to easily identify images that you want to stick together. And if you're curious about color labels, I have an entire video on setting color labels, flags, and ratings, and I definitely recommend you check that out. So let's get back to talking about our panorama. We have our images selected here. You can see we started from the right-hand side of the screen, and I kept taking images. You can see they have quite a bit of overlap. You don't want any gaps in your panorama. And that is a pretty wide panorama we have there. Let's go ahead, let's select our first image. I'm going to hold Shift, select our last image, and I'm going to right-click, Photo Merge, and go to Panorama. We also have the option of creating an HDR image if you have bracketed exposures. I will have an entire video on bracketed exposures and creating an HDR shot. We also have the option of creating bracketed panoramas, which will combine these 2 techniques, which shouldn't be an issue for you after you see how to create a panorama and an HDR photo. So we're going to select Panorama, and it's going to take Lightroom just a second here to build your panorama. And you can see we have these white spaces here at the top and here at the bottom. And that is indicating where we do not have image data, because you can see here, my first shot was framed up over here. And by the time I got all the way over here to the left, my camera angle dropped quite a bit because I was not using a tripod. I was shooting these handheld. So you have to be very careful, or you will end up getting some space like this on the top and the bottom. The important part is that you don't have those gaps here in the middle, or you will have all sorts of issues. So make sure that your images are overlapping and you are taking very steady shots with a nice straight horizon. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to fix all of this here in just a minute, and you won't even be able to tell how bad I messed it up when I was shooting this photo. So let's go ahead and let's talk about some of our options we have here. Let's talk about projections first. We have the option of spherical, cylindrical, and perspective. So what is our first option here? Our spherical projection. So our spherical projection option will align and transform our images as if they were wrapped around the inside of a sphere. This option is great when you have very wide panoramas like this. We have a 9-shot panorama, and it's also great for multi-row panoramas. For example, if I want to take another row of the sky here, or if I want to take some shots where I got more of the street here, using a spherical projection would be a great way to recreate that panorama. How about cylindrical? Now, cylindrical is somewhat similar to spherical. Lightroom treats your images as if it were mapping them to the inside of a cylinder. It's really good at keeping these vertical lines here straight. I definitely recommend using cylindrical if you're shooting a very wide panorama, especially if it is just a single row of images, just like we have here. Now, perspective is really recommended for smaller panoramas and smaller stitched together scenes. For example, it doesn't work so great here on this 9-image panorama. You can see our edges are warping in here a little bit, and you can see the big difference between cylindrical and perspective. Again, use this on smaller panoramas, architectural panoramas where you want all of your lines to remain straight, because perspective is essentially mapping your image onto a flat surface or giving that appearance. So for this example, I'm probably going to use cylindrical. We have a single row and it is a very wide panorama. Let's go ahead and look at some of our other options we have here. We have boundary warp. Remember how we talked about these white spaces here? Really don't like those white spaces because that means I'm really going to have to crop into this image to cover those white spaces up. So I can use boundary warp, see what it does here. I'll just use a little bit at a time to warp my panorama to make it fit this pre-existing crop that I have. I can also use a mixture of boundary warp and I can check this fill edges. Lightroom is going to analyze our scene, look at our different pixels, look at the overall scene, and it's going to try and recreate and fill these pixels and empty areas. I typically use a mixture of boundary warp and fill edges. That way I don't have Lightroom making up a ton of pixels on its own. That gives a lot of room for mistakes and some weird areas that I'll have to clone stamp out or fix manually later. But this looks pretty great for Lightroom just coming up with those pixels by itself. And you can make adjustments here to the boundary warp and fill edges. Just know that each time you do, Lightroom will have to rebuild that preview. And sometimes it'll take just a couple seconds here. Sometimes it'll take a couple minutes. You can see in this instance, we have this kind of little vent pipe on top of this building here. It's doing some weird warping because Lightroom doesn't exactly know how to recreate those pixels. So I'm going to go back to the original settings that I had. So we have a couple other options here. We have auto crop, which is grayed out right now because I have my fill edges option turned on. So you can see there is no need to automatically crop this image when I'm not seeing any white space. If I were to turn off fill edges, you can see now my image needs to be cropped in. I can let Lightroom decide where to crop that image. That looks pretty good. I can turn that on or off. I prefer fill edges. That's just less work that I'm going to have to do later. And I can also select auto settings, which allows Lightroom to automatically decide my settings for me before I even stitch this panorama together. This is a pretty quick and dirty way just to see what it would look like after you edit your image, kind of a quick preview. And you can always change these settings back because you're still working with 9 raw images. They are just stitched together. Sometimes I will check or uncheck that. When it's off, I feel like maybe it works a little bit faster. I'm not 100% sure. And we have our last option here to create a stack, and this will essentially stack all of these images. You can unstack them later, but it's similar to color labels. It just kind of organizes your photos together. So when we think we are good and we think this image looks good, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn on auto settings just to show you guys what that does to our final pano. And I'm going to hit merge. Now what's going to happen is you will see in the upper left hand corner of the image, it will say creating panorama. And this is essentially a background task. If you have a huge panorama, this may take a minute or a couple minutes, but you can go ahead, you can work on other images, you can go ahead and do other things, and this panorama will be merged in the background. So let's skip ahead to when this panorama is completed. So our panorama is complete. This looks pretty darn good. We can see down in our film strip here, image number 14, we still have our yellow color label from all of our images, and you can see this little stack with a number 10 here. If I click this, it will expand that stack, or I can hit that number 1 of 10 again and collapse that stack. We just have these 9 images and we don't need to edit them individually anymore. Now we can just edit the panorama. And that's what happens when you hit that create stack tool. We can go ahead, we can go to our basic tool, do a little toning, and look at that. Lightroom did some automatic toning for us. It looks pretty good, but I will obviously go in here. I will make some corrections. The first thing I'll do is typically change my profile to landscape, just add a tiny bit more punch to this. But if you want to learn a little bit more about toning, be sure to watch my basic toning video in the beginning of the 30 Days of Lightroom series if you haven't already. So that is as simple as it gets to making a panorama in Lightroom. I hope you learned something in this video. If you found it useful, be sure to hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and of course share this video with a friend. And until next time, get out and go shoot.